Outlaw's widow agreed to cook for a cowboy, then found his face on her husband's wanted poster. She thought cooking for strangers was the safest way to survive, until she discovered the gentle cowboy at her table had killed alongside her dead husband. The cabin sat like a broken tooth against the endless sky, its weathered boards gray as old bones. Martha Caldwell stood at the single window, watching dust devils dance across the barren earth where her husband's dreams had once taken root. 3 years had passed since Jack's body came home draped over his horse, 3 bullets in his chest, and the law's justice finally served. 3 years of scraping by on what little remained of a life built on stolen time and borrowed hope. The tin can on her kitchen shelf held 4 silver coins. For coins between her and the winter that would come howling across the plains like a hungry ghost. Her fingers traced the rough wood of the windowsill, counting the splinters as she counted the days since her last real meal. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her dark thoughts. A lone rider approached through the heat shimmer, his horse moving with the steady gait of a man who knew where he was going. Martha stepped back from the window, her hand instinctively smoothing her worn calico dress. Visitors were rare in this forgotten corner of the territory. Most folks knew better than to seek out the widow of Jack Caldwell. The rider stopped at her gate, removing his hat as he dismounted. Even from a distance, she could see the careful way he moved, like a man who had learned to be gentle through great effort. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn but well cared for. When he knocked on her door, the sound was soft and respectful. "Ma'am." His voice carried the weight of politeness learned through hardship. "I'm wondering if you might be willing to cook a hot meal for a traveling man. I can pay fair." Martha opened the door just wide enough to study him. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 years to her 28. His face was tanned by countless suns, but his eyes held a kindness that made her chest tighten with memory. When was the last time someone had looked at her without judgment or pity? "I ain't running a boarding house," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, ma'am. I wouldn't presume. Just thought." He gestured toward the empty corral, the garden choked with weeds, the general air of barely hanging on. "Thought maybe we could help each other out. I got coin, and I ain't had a home-cooked meal in more weeks than I care to count." The silver dollar he placed on her doorstep caught the afternoon light like a promise. Martha stared at it, calculating. 1 meal for $1 will buy her flour, salt, maybe even coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory she'd been stretching for months. "What's your name?" she asked. "Samultu, Mom." He replaced his hat, the gesture respectful. "And I already know you're Mrs. Caldwell. Folks in town mentioned you might be willing to trade cooking for coin." The lie was kind, Martha knew. Nobody in town would recommend her for anything. But Samuel Turner's eyes held no mockery, only a quiet understanding that made her want to trust him despite every lesson her husband's life had taught her about trusting strangers. "Supper's at sunset," she heard herself saying. "You bring your own plate." "Yes, ma'am. Much obliged." She watched him ride toward the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick, probably to make camp. Only then did she realize she was holding her breath. The silver dollar lay warm in her palm as she closed the door and leaned against it, heart beating fast as a rabbit's. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. She had little to work with: dried beans she'd been saving, an onion from her struggling garden, cornmeal that would have to last another week if she was careful. But her hands remembered the motions of cooking for someone who mattered, and slowly the cabin filled with smells that spoke of home rather than mere survival. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood, Martha set 2 plates on her small table. The action felt strange after 3 years of eating alone, standing over the stove, or sometimes not at all when the loneliness grew too heavy to swallow around. Samuel returned as promised, carrying a battered tin plate and a cup worn smooth by countless hands. He had washed in the creek. She could smell the clean scent of water on his skin, see where he'd tried to tame his dark hair with wet fingers. "Smells like heaven, ma'am," he said, settling into the chair across from her. His hands were clean but scarred, the nails trimmed short. Working hands. Honest hands, she thought, then immediately chided herself for the assumption. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against plates and the evening wind testing the cabin's loose boards. Martha found herself studying his face in the lamplight, the way he chewed thoughtfully, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the careful way he broke his cornbread as if every crumb mattered. "This is fine cooking," Samuel said finally. "Been a long time since I tasted anything this good." "Where you headed?" Martha asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "Nowhere in particular. Just riding until I find a reason to stop." He met her eyes across the table. "What about you?" "This always been home. 3 years now." She didn't offer more, and he didn't push. Some stories, his silence seemed to say, were earned rather than asked for. When the meal was finished, Samuel placed 2 silver dollars on the table. Martha stared at them, confused. "One for night," he said. "One for tomorrow, if you'll have me back." "That's too much. Not for a meal that reminds a man what it feels like to be welcome somewhere." He stood, gathering his plate and cup. "Thank you, ma'am, for the food and the company both." After he left, Martha sat at her table, counting the coins by lamplight. $4 now instead of 4. Enough for supplies, enough to push winter back a little further. But it was more than the money that made her chest feel tight with something she had almost forgotten how to name. Hope, maybe. Or just the memory of what it felt like to matter to someone, even if only for the length of a shared meal. She blew out the lamp and walked to the window, watching Samuel's campfire flicker among the cottonwoods. Tomorrow he would return, and she would cook for him again. The thought should have brought simple satisfaction. Another dollar earned, another day's survival secured. Instead, as she watched the distant flame dance in the darkness, Martha Caldwell felt something she hadn't felt since Jack died, the dangerous warmth of wanting someone to stay. But in the morning light, would Samuel Turner still seem like salvation, or would he prove to be just another kind of trouble wearing a gentleman's face? She was finally learning to trust again, until she found her dead husband's wanted poster with 2 faces on it, and one of them was sitting at her kitchen table. 5 days passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Samuel arrived each evening as the sun touched the horizon, always with clean hands and a respectful tip of his hat, always with 2 silver dollars placed carefully beside his empty plate when the meal was done. Martha found herself listening for his horse's hoofbeats, found herself taking extra care with her hair before he knocked. On the 3rd evening, he brought wildflowers, nothing fancy, just a handful of Indian paintbrush and prairie grass gathered from the meadow by the thought they might brighten the table, he said, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Martha arranged them in a mason jar, their red blooms like small flames against the rough wood. "You don't have to," she said, but her fingers lingered on the petals. "Man ought to show appreciation for kindness," Samuel replied. "My mama taught me that, back when I still listened to what she had to say." It was the first time he'd mentioned family. Martha wanted to ask more, but something in his eyes warned her away from that particular door. They all had doors better left closed, she supposed. The frontier was full of people running from something. Instead, she served him cornbread still warm from the Dutch oven and listened to him talk about the country he'd seen. Mountains that scraped the belly of heaven, rivers so wide you couldn't see the other side, cities where the buildings grew tall as trees. His voice painted pictures that made her small cabin feel smaller, but also somehow safer. A harbor in the storm of his wandering. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked on the 4th night, gesturing toward the walls that had become both shelter and prison. Martha considered the question while she cleared their plates. "Every day," she admitted, "but wanting to leave and having somewhere to go are different things entirely. There's work for women in the territories. School teaching, cooking in logging camps, even running stores in some of the bigger towns." Samuel's voice was gentle, like he was offering her a gift he wasn't sure she'd accept. "A woman with your skills wouldn't starve." "A woman with my name might," Martha said, the words bitter as burnt coffee. Folks, don't forget who you married, even after he's dead. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes a name is just something you carry until you find a better one, he said finally. I've known a few people who learned that truth. The way he said it made Martha look at him more carefully. There was something in his voice, a weight that spoke of personal knowledge. But before she could ask, he was standing, gathering his things, placing his payment on the table with the same careful precision he'd shown every night. After he left, Martha found herself staring at the wildflowers, their colors muted now in the lamplight. Samuel Turner. Even his name had a solid sound to it, like something you could build a life on. Not like Jack Caldwell, which had always sounded to her like trouble looking for a place to land. On the fifth evening, Samuel arrived later than usual, his horse lathered with sweat as if they'd been riding hard. There was tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes that reminded Martha of the way Jack used to look when he came home from his business trips, like a man expecting trouble to follow him through the door. "Everything all right?" she asked as he settled into his chair. "Saw some riders heading this way earlier," Samuel said. "Might be nothing, but—" He shrugged, but his hand rested near the gun at his hip. "Just wanted to make sure you're being careful, is all." Martha's blood chilled. Riders meant questions, and questions meant trouble. What kind of riders? The kind that wear badges and ask too many questions. Samuel's voice was carefully neutral, but Martha caught the warning underneath. You might want to keep your curtains drawn for a few days. Let them pass on by without taking notice. After he left that night, Martha found she couldn't sleep. She paced the small cabin like a caged animal, checking the locks, peering through the curtains at every sound. The money Samuel had paid her was hidden beneath a loose floorboard, along with what little remained of Jack's possessions. His spare gun, a few personal items she'd never had the heart to burn or bury. It was while retrieving the money to count it again, as if the coins might multiply through repeated handling, that Martha's fingers brushed against something else. A folded paper, yellowed with age and soft with handling. She pulled it out, unfolding it carefully in the lamplight. The wanted poster was 3 years old, the ink faded but still readable. Wanted dead or alive, screamed across the top in bold letters. Below it, 2 faces stared back at her from the creased paper. Jack's face she knew by heart, the cold eyes, the cruel twist to his mouth that she'd learned to fear in their final months together. But it was the second face that made her hands begin to tremble. The features were younger, softer, but unmistakably familiar. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, the same scar above the left eyebrow. Samuel Turner, the poster read, though the name below the photograph was different. Samuel Hayes. Wanted for the murder of Sheriff William Hayes in connection with the robbery of the Millerville Bank. Known associate of Jack Caldwell. Martha sank into her chair, the poster fluttering to the table like a dead bird. Samuel Hayes. Not Turner, Hayes. And the murdered sheriff? She studied the name again, her heart hammering against her ribs. The same last name. Father, maybe, or brother. The gentle man who had brought her wildflowers, who spoke of mountains and rivers and new beginnings, was the same man who had ridden with her husband on that final, bloody job. The job that had brought Jack home with 3 bullets in his chest and the law's justice finally served. But if Samuel was there when Jack died, why was he here now? Why was he alive when her husband was 3 years in the ground? Martha's hand shook as she stared at the 2 faces on the poster, her dead husband's sneer and Samuel's younger, cleaner features. The Samuel in the photograph looked harder somehow, hungrier, but the scar was the same. The eyes, despite their youth, held the same careful kindness she'd learned to trust over 5 shared meals. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of her cabin like bones in a box. Martha folded the poster with trembling fingers, her mind racing. She thought of Samuel's stories about distant places, his suggestion that she could start over somewhere new. Had those been invitations or warnings? Kindness or manipulation? She thought of his clean hands and respectful manner, the way he listened when she spoke of Jack without judgment or pity. She thought of his payment, Always exact, always generous. Was it guilt money? Payment for some debt he owed to Jack's memory? Or was it something else entirely? The careful courtship of a man who needed something from Jack Caldwell's widow? The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Martha stared at those shadows, seeing in them the shapes of all the lies and half-truths that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow evening, Samuel would return. He would knock on her door with his careful politeness, remove his hat with his practiced respect, and sit at her table as he had for 5 nights running. But now Martha knew the truth behind his gentle eyes. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The poster lay folded on the table between her empty coffee cup and the mason jar of dying wildflowers. 2 faces from her past, one dead and buried, the other very much alive and coming to her door with sunset. Martha Caldwell had survived 3 years of loneliness and poverty. But she wasn't sure she could survive the weight of this new knowledge or the choice it would force her to make. When she confronted him with the wanted poster, he didn't run or deny it. He just sat there like a man who'd been waiting 3 years for Judgment Day to finally arrive. Martha didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table through the long night, the wanted poster spread before her like a roadmap to hell. The lamp burned low, casting shifting shadows that made the 2 faces seem to move and whisper in the darkness. By dawn, her coffee had gone cold 3 times, and her hands had memorized every crease and fold of that damning piece of paper. When the sun finally broke over the eastern hills, painting her cabin walls the color of dried blood, Martha knew what she had to do. She folded the poster carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, then set about preparing what might be Samuel Hayes's, last meal at her table. The day crawled by like a wounded animal. Martha found herself starting at every sound. The creak of settling wood, the whistle of wind through the eaves, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Her hands shook as she kneaded bread dough, as she tended her meager garden, as she counted and recounted the silver dollars Samuel had paid her for 5 nights of lies. When evening came, she was ready. The table was set with unusual care, her best plates, such as they were, and the wildflowers Samuel had brought, though they were beginning to wilt. If this was to be their last supper together, she would make it a proper one. Samuel arrived as the sun touched the horizon, same as always. But tonight Martha watched him with new eyes as he dismounted, as he approached her door, as he removed his hat with that careful respect she now knew was practiced rather than natural. How many times had he done this? How many widows had he charmed with his gentle manner and generous payments? "Evening, ma'am," he said, and his voice was the same as always, warm, respectful, tinged with something that might have been affection. "Mr. Hayes," Martha replied, and watched the color drain from his face. For a moment, they stood frozen in her doorway like figures in a daguerreotype. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. His eyes searched her face, looking for answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Ma'am," he said finally, and now his voice was different, smaller, older, like a boy caught in a lie by his schoolteacher. Martha stepped aside, gesturing him into the cabin. "Come in and sit down, Samuel. We have things to discuss." He entered slowly, his movements careful and controlled. When Martha closed the door behind him, the sound seemed to echo like a gunshot. Samuel took his usual chair, but his posture was different now, straighter, more watchful. The easy comfort of their previous evenings was gone, replaced by the terrible tension of truth about to be spoken. Martha pulled the wanted poster from her apron and placed it on the table between them. Samuel stared at it for a long moment, his face expressionless. Then he looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes something she hadn't expected, relief. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since last night." Martha's voice was steadier than she felt. "I found it among Jack's things. 3 years I've had that poster, and I never looked at it closely enough to recognize the face that's been sitting at my table for 5 nights running." Samuel nodded slowly. "Samuel Hayes was my name then. My father's name. The Sheriff Jack and I." He stopped, swallowing hard. The sheriff we killed was my own father. The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She sank in her chair, staring at this man she thought she was beginning to know. Your father? William Hayes. Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. He was a good man. Fair. Honest. Everything I wasn't in those days. He touched the scar above his eyebrow, and Martha realized it was the same gesture she'd seen him make dozens of times. A nervous habit born of old shame. I was 18, stupid as a fence post, and angry at everything that. When Jack Caldwell came through our town talking about easy money and a better life, I listened. God help me, I listened. You killed your own father. The words felt like stones in Martha's mouth. I didn't pull the trigger, Samuel said quickly, then shook his head. But that don't make me innocent. I was there. I was part of it. When my father recognized me under that bandana, when he said my name, Samuel's hands clenched into fists on the table. Jack shot him before he could say another word. Said we couldn't afford to leave witnesses who knew who we were. Martha felt tears burning her eyes, though she couldn't have said if they were for Samuel's father, for the boy he'd been, or for her own shattered trust. And you just rode away? Left him bleeding in the street. I wanted to go to him. Samuel's voice cracked. But Jack grabbed my reins, said the law would be coming, so we had to ride or we'd both be dancing at the end of a rope. So I rode. God forgive me. I rode away and left my father dying in the dirt. The silence that followed was heavy as a burial shroud. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the cabin walls like the ghosts of all their sins demanding entry. Why are you here? Martha asked finally. Why now? Why me? Samuel reached into his coat, and Martha tensed. But what he pulled out wasn't a gun. It was a leather pouch, heavy with the weight of metal. He set it on the table beside the wanted poster. $3,000, he said. My share of what we took that day. I've been carrying it for 3 years, trying to figure out what to do with it. Can't spend it, can't give it back to the bank. They're long gone now anyway. But then I heard about Jack's death, heard about his widow struggling to make ends meet, and I knew. Knew what? That maybe this was how I could start to make things right. Samuel's eyes met hers across the table. I didn't come here to hurt you, Martha. I came to give you what was yours by right. Jack's share of that blood money. It won't bring back my father, won't wash the stain from my soul, but maybe it can keep you from starving. Martha stared at the pouch, her mind reeling. $3,000. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. Enough to start over anywhere she wanted, to become anyone she chose to be. You think money makes this right? She asked, and now her voice was rising, 3 years of grief and anger finally finding their target. You think paying me off will balance the scales for what you and my husband... No, Samuel said simply. Nothing makes this right. Nothing ever will. But it's all I have to offer. Martha stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the rough. Get out. Samuel didn't move. Martha, get out. The words tore from her throat like a scream. Get out of my house, get off my land, and don't you ever come back. But still Samuel didn't rise. Instead, he looked at her with those same kind eyes that had fooled her for 5 long evenings, and spoke words that cut deeper than any knife. Where am I supposed to go, Martha? What am I supposed to do? I've been running for 3 years, and it don't matter how far I ride or how many new names I take. I'm still the man who helped kill his own father. I'm still the boy who chose the wrong path and can't find his way back. His voice broke on the last words, and Martha saw tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. This wasn't the composed, gentle cowboy she'd been cooking for. This was a broken man carrying a weight too heavy for any soul to bear. I didn't come here to trick you or hurt you, Samuel continued. I came because I thought maybe if I could do one decent thing, if I could help the one person in this world who understood what it meant to live with Jack Caldwell's choices, maybe I could find a way to forgive myself. Martha felt her anger wavering like a candle in the wind. This man had lied to her, had sat at her table and let her feed him while hiding the truth about her husband's death. But looking at him now, seeing the raw pain in his eyes, she realized he was as much a victim of that day as she was. "I should turn you in," she said, but the words had no strength behind them. "Yes," Samuel agreed. "You should. It's what I deserve." The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, full darkness was falling, and somewhere in the distance, Martha could hear the lonely howl of a coyote calling for its pack. But in her small cabin, two broken souls sat across from each other at a table laden with untouched food and blood money, trying to figure out if redemption was possible for people like them. People who had loved the wrong person, made the wrong choices, and spent too many nights wondering if God had given up on them entirely. The reckoning Martha had planned for became something else entirely. Not judgment, but recognition. Not justice, but the terrible, complicated mercy that grows between two people who have walked through the same kind of hell and somehow found each other on the other side. But mercy was a luxury neither of them was sure they could afford. And morning would bring its own harsh light to shine on the choices they would have to make. She had every right to turn him in for killing alongside her husband. But sometimes mercy grows in the most scorched places, watered by tears and tended by broken hearts learning to heal. Dawn came slowly, as if the sun itself was reluctant to shine light on the choices that waited in Martha Caldwell's cabin. She had spent the night in her chair by the cold stove, watching Samuel sleep fitfully on her floor where he had collapsed after their long, terrible conversation. His face, even in sleep, carried the weight of 3 years' worth of nightmares. The wanted poster lay on the table where she had left it, its edges curling in the dry air. $3,000 in blood money sat beside it, the leather pouch dark with age and handling. Two paths stretched before Martha like roads diverging in a wilderness. Justice and mercy, vengeance and forgiveness, the law and something deeper than law that her heart was still learning to name. Martha rose quietly, stepping over Samuel's sleeping form to make coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The familiar motions calmed her, measuring grounds, stoking the fire, filling the pot with water from the bucket by the door. Simple tasks for a woman facing the most complicated decision of her life. Samuel stirred as the smell of coffee filled the cabin. He sat up slowly, his back against the wall, and looked at her with eyes that expected nothing good. In the morning light, she could see how young he really was under the weathering and the guilt. 21, maybe 22. Still a boy in many ways, despite the man's burden he carried. "I won't run," he said quietly. "If you've decided to turn me in, I won't make you chase me." Martha poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and she noticed his hands were steady now, resigned. "Why?" she asked. "Because running hasn't made anything better," Samuel said. "Because my father deserves justice, even if it comes 3 years too late. Because—" He paused, looking down into his coffee cup as if searching for words in the dark liquid. "Because maybe some sins are too heavy to carry alone." Martha walked to the table and picked up the wanted poster. The paper felt fragile in her hands, like it might crumble at any moment. Jack's face stared up at her, cold, cruel, unrepentant even in death. Beside it, Samuel's younger face looked back with eyes that held no such hardness, only fear and the terrible innocence of youth making its first real mistake. "Tell me about your father," she said. Samuel looked up, surprised. "Mom? Your father? William Hayes. What kind of man was he?" A ghost of a smile crossed Samuel's face. "The best kind. Patient with fools, gentle with children, fair with everyone who came before his bench. He taught me to fish, to read, to shoe a horse. Said a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't help him." Samuel's voice cracked. "I used to think he was weak because he wouldn't fight back when the town drunks got rowdy. Thought he should be harder, meaner. I was so young and stupid, I couldn't see that it takes more strength to be kind than to be cruel." Martha nodded slowly. She understood about men who chose kindness over cruelty, about the strength that took. Samuel, for all his sins, had shown her that same gentleness these past 5 days. Maybe it wasn't learned behavior after all. Maybe it was something deeper, something he'd inherited from a good man and lost along the way. What would he want you to do now, she asked. Make amends, Samuel said without hesitation. Help people instead of hurting them. Use whatever years I have left to balance the scales, even knowing they'll never truly balance. Martha walked to the stove and pulled a burning stick from the fire. Samuel watched, confused, as she held the flame to the edge of the wanted poster. The paper caught quickly, curling and blackening as the fire consumed 3 years of fear and running. Ma'am, were you? My name is Martha, she said, watching Jack's face disappear into ash. And I'm not turning you in, Samuel Hayes. The poster crumbled into nothing, falling like black snow onto her table. Samuel stared at the ashes, then at her, his mouth open in shock. I don't understand. Justice and the law aren't always the same thing, Martha said, echoing words her own father had spoken long ago. Hanging you won't bring your father back. It won't undo what happened that day. But maybe, she paused, gathering courage for words she'd never thought she'd say. Maybe we can do something better with the time we have left. Samuel set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. Martha, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing. She picked up the pouch of money, testing its weight. But this blood money can't stay here. It's poisoned everything it's touched, and it'll poison us too if we let it. What do you want to do with it? Martha already knew. The idea had been growing in her mind like a seed finding purchase in scorched earth. There's a cemetery 2 miles west of here. Small place, mostly forgotten. That's where Jack is buried. Samuel's face went pale. You want to take it to his grave? I want to bury it with him. In this thing properly. Martha met his eyes. Will you come with me? The ride to the cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. Samuel had saddled Jack's old horse for Martha, a gesture that should have felt like sacrilege, but somehow felt like closure instead. The money rode heavy in Samuel's saddlebags, a burden they would finally lay to rest. Jack's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, the paint already peeling after 3 years of weather. Martha knelt beside it, running her fingers over the carved letters of his name. So much anger, so much pain, all reduced to this patch of earth and fading wood. Samuel dismounted and pulled a shovel from his pack. Without being asked, he began to dig beside the grave, his movements careful and respectful. When the hole was deep enough, he handed Martha the pouch. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of all the choices that had brought them to this moment. Then she placed it gently in the earth and stepped back. Samuel filled the hole slowly, tamping down the dirt with the back of a shovel. It's finished, Martha said when he was done. Yes, ma'am. Samuel leaned on the shovel, breathing hard. What happens now? Martha looked at him, really looked at him. Not the wanted man or Jack's partner in crime, but the young man who had brought her wildflowers and listened to her stories and carried 3 years of guilt like stones in his chest. What do you want to happen? I want to stay, Samuel said quietly. I want to help you fix up that cabin, tend that garden, maybe build something good from all this wreckage. But I know I don't have the right to want that. Rights are something we give each other, Martha said, and I'm giving you the right to try. Samuel's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground beside Jack's grave, great sobs shaking his shoulders. Martha knelt beside him, her hand finding his back, offering what comfort she could to a man learning that forgiveness was possible even for sins that felt unforgivable. They rode back to the cabin in the golden light of late afternoon, 2 broken people who had somehow found a way to be broken together instead of alone. There would be hard days ahead, trust to rebuild, grief to work through, the careful negotiation of 2 damaged souls learning to share the same small space. But there would also be shared meals and quiet conversations, the satisfaction of honest work and the slow miracle of healing. Over the months that followed, they built something neither of them had expected. Not love, exactly, that was too simple a word for what grew between them. But understanding. Partnership. The recognition that sometimes the best you could do was tend your small corner of the world and help one person find their way home. Samuel proved as good with his hands as he was with his heart. He repaired the cabin's loose boards, fixed the broken fence, coaxed life back into Martha's struggling garden. Martha taught him to cook properly, to mend clothes, to read the weather in the movement of clouds. They worked side by side through summer heat and autumn chill, building a life from the ashes of their former selves. On Christmas Eve, as snow began to fall outside their small, warm cabin, Samuel placed a wooden cross on the mantel. Not a religious symbol, but a memorial he had carved for his father. The wood was smooth and beautiful, polished with love and grief in equal measure. "Do you think he would forgive me?" Samuel asked, watching the firelight play across the carved surface. "I think he already has," Martha said. "Good men don't raise sons who are capable of this kind of change without some goodness to work with." Samuel nodded, tears in his eyes. "I want to be worthy of that forgiveness." "Then keep trying," Martha said simply. "Every day, just keep trying." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh landscape in gentle white. Inside, two people who had lost everything learned that sometimes the most precious things grew not in rich soil, but in the scorched places where nothing should survive. They had planted seeds in the wasteland of their shared grief, and somehow, against all reason and expectation, those seeds had taken root and grown into something worth tending. Something worth calling home.